The red notice trembled in my hands as I stood frozen on my Victorian porch. $100,000. The HOA fine seemed impossible, absurd even. I hadn't built anything on my property in 20 years. But the rumbling of excavators behind my family's 5-acre plot told a different story. If you're watching from anywhere that values property rights, drop a comment below. I walked around my house, my morning coffee forgotten, and what I saw defied belief. 9 foundation slabs stretched across my inherited land like concrete scars. Construction crews moved with practiced efficiency, as if they belonged there. Daniel Fitzgerald's signature stared up at me from the HOA notice, but I'd never given anyone permission to touch my property. This was the morning I discovered that in Willowbrook Estates, ownership meant nothing when the HOA president wanted your land. My name is Margaret Reynolds, and until that Tuesday morning in April, I thought property deeds meant something in America. The postal carrier had insisted I sign for the certified letter. His expression apologetic as he handed over the blazing red envelope. Standing on the wraparound porch of my childhood home in Willowbrook Estates, Colorado, I felt the weight of 3 generations pressing down through that single page. My grandparents had claimed these 5 acres in 1942, built this Victorian with their own hands. Now, according to the screaming red letters before me, I owed $100,000 for unauthorized construction activities. The fine amount made my knees weak. I hadn't built anything since inheriting the property 2 years ago. The signature at the bottom belonged to Daniel Fitzgerald, HOA president and owner of Fitzgerald Development Group, a detail I'd only recently discovered. The rumbling of heavy machinery suddenly penetrated my shock. The sound came from behind my property, where it had no business being. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the porch boards as I rounded the house. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. Across my back acreage, 9 concrete foundation slabs spread in neat rows. Orange-vested workers operated excavators and cement trucks with casual efficiency. I'd been visiting my sister in Denver for the past 2 weeks, helping with her surgery recovery. They must have started the moment I left town, working just within the 7 to 5 construction ordinance to avoid noise complaints from neighbors who might have alerted me. "This is private property," I shouted, waving my arms as I approached the nearest worker. "Stop immediately." The young man gestured toward a construction trailer without looking up. Inside, Site Supervisor Rick Matthews showed me permits with my signature. Clear as day, on documents I'd never seen. "That's not my signature," I said, voice shaking with controlled rage. "This is fraud." He shrugged with practiced indifference. "Take it up with the developer. I just follow work orders." The developer name made my stomach drop. Apex Corporation, with Daniel Fitzgerald listed as project liaison. I drove straight to the HOA management office. Fury replacing shock. The receptionist avoided eye contact as I demanded to see Fitzgerald. His office radiated calculated wealth, mahogany and leather designed to intimidate. He looked up from his desk with a practiced smile, silver hair perfectly styled. "Margaret, please sit. I understand you have concerns about the community improvement project." "Community improvement?" I remained standing. "You're building on my land without permission. You forged my signature." His expression shifted to concern, almost fatherly. "That's quite an accusation. Are you certain you didn't sign something during your recent difficult time? Grief can affect memory. I know losing your mother was hard." The false sympathy, they made my skin crawl. "Don't you dare bring my mother into this. I know exactly what I've signed and what I haven't." His smile cooled by degrees. "Of course, but the fact remains that construction has begun based on legal permits. Stopping it now would cost the community hundreds of thousands in breach of contract fees. Surely you wouldn't want your neighbors to suffer for a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I leaned forward. "You mean theft, grand theft, Federal mail fraud. Shall I continue listing the crimes? The mask finally slipped completely. His eyes went hard as granite. I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. That $100,000 fine, it's just the beginning. The HOA has resources you can't imagine. Legal resources. Political resources. He stood, looming over his desk. Ask the Harrisons why they sold last year. Ask the Colemans why Florida suddenly seemed so appealing. Willowbrook Estates is evolving, and dinosaurs who can't adapt get buried. Are you threatening me? I kept my voice steady despite the chill running down my spine. I'm explaining reality, he said smoothly. You're a retired schoolteacher living alone in a house too big for her. No husband, no children to help fight your battles. I've been president here for 6 years. I know every judge, every city councilman, every person who matters in this county. Who do you think they'll believe when push comes to shove? The calculation in his eyes told me everything. This wasn't his first time. The Harrisons, the Colemans, others he hadn't named. They'd all faced this moment, but they'd been isolated, afraid, overwhelmed by the machine Fitzgerald had built. You're right about one thing, I said, standing to leave. I am a teacher, and teachers know how to do research, build cases, and present evidence. You want a fight? You just got one. His laughter followed me out. Don't say I didn't try to handle this civilly. Margaret, what happens next is on you. As I left the building, my hands shook with adrenaline rather than fear. Fitzgerald had made a critical error. He'd shown his hand too early, confirming this was a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Somewhere in Willowbrook Estates were others who'd been silenced by fear or forced out by corruption. I needed to find them, unite them, and build a case that even his connections couldn't bury. But first, I needed a lawyer who wasn't afraid of taking on the local power structure, because my grandfather hadn't broken his back building our home, just so some corrupt developer could steal it with forged signatures and HOA intimidation. The war for my property had begun, and I'd use every legal weapon available. In Willowbrook Estates, Daniel Fitzgerald was about to learn that some people don't bury easily, no matter how deep you try to dig their graves. The next 48 hours taught me how an HOA president could weaponize bureaucracy. Wednesday morning, I woke to find my water shut off mid-shower, soap still in my hair. The utility company claimed the HOA had reported a serious leak requiring immediate intervention. When I finally reached a supervisor, she explained that Fitzgerald sat on the Municipal Services Advisory Board. His emergency reports received priority processing, no questions asked. By the time I proved no leak existed and got service restored, I'd lost half a day and gained a new understanding of how deep his tentacles reached into the community infrastructure. Michael Torres came highly recommended by a friend who'd fought her own HOA battle in Denver. Young, sharp, and most importantly, completely unconnected to Willowbrook Estates' political web. He arrived at my home on Friday morning, taking in the construction chaos visible from my kitchen window. They're not even trying to hide it, he said, adjusting his glasses as an excavator rumbled past. That's either extreme arrogance or complete confidence in their legal position. It's arrogance, I said, pouring coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Fitzgerald practically confessed when I confronted him. He's done this before. Michael opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keys. Let's start with the forged signatures. I'll need any documents you've signed for the HOA in the past 5 years for comparison. But first, we need to stop that construction before they finish those houses. Once they're built, everything gets exponentially more complicated. We spent 3 hours documenting everything. Michael photographed the construction, recorded serial numbers on the equipment, and noted every company name on every truck. His attention to detail impressed me. Each photo was tagged with timestamps and GPS coordinates. The permits show your signature dated April 2nd, he said, studying his screen. Where were you that day? I pulled up my calendar, relief flooding through me. Denver, at Presbyterian Hospital with my sister Patricia. I have receipts, parking stubs, even a selfie she insisted on taking after her surgery. His smile was sharp. Perfect. Hard to sign documents in Willowbrook when you're documented 2 hours away. That evening, I discovered Fitzgerald's next escalation. Opening my laptop to check emails, I found my neighborhood's community page flooded with posts about me. Concerned about Margaret Reynolds's mental state. Read one from an account created just days ago. She screamed at construction workers just doing their jobs. Classic signs of dementia. Another claimed I'd been seen talking to myself in the garden, clearly confused and agitated. The character assassination was surgical, each post carefully crafted to plant doubt while avoiding outright defamation. Nancy Patterson crossed the street to avoid me at the mailbox Saturday morning. But I forced myself to follow Michael's advice. Don't engage. Screenshot everything. This consciousness of guilt helps our case. The weekend brought new revelations. Michael had pulled the property records through a title company contact who owed him a favor from a previous case. I had to call in some chips, he explained, but it was worth it. The HOA filed a document 3 weeks ago claiming you'd granted them development rights. But here's where it gets interesting. The notary who verified your signature, she works for Fitzgerald Development, and according to her social media posts, she was on vacation in Cabo that entire week. So we can prove fraud, I asked, hope flickering for the first time since this nightmare began. We can prove suspicious circumstances, he corrected carefully. But I found something even better. When I compared your original survey from the county archives with the one filed with these permits. There's a 20-foot discrepancy on your eastern boundary. They've literally redrawn your property line. He pulled up satellite images on his laptop, overlaying the 2 surveys. Your actual boundary runs along that creek. They've moved it to exclude the most buildable portion of your land. That's deliberate falsification of official documents. That's a felony. Sunday morning brought the cruelest blow yet. An orange notice on my door declared my 100-year-old oak tree an imminent safety hazard, requiring immediate removal. The tree that had sheltered 3 generations. Where my grandfather had built my mother's swing. Where my parents' ashes were scattered beneath its roots. Was scheduled for destruction on Monday morning. The notice bore all 5 HOA board members' signatures. They're trying to break you emotionally, Michael said when I called him. My voice choked with tears I couldn't hold back. That tree is perfectly healthy. Nowhere near any structures. I'll file an emergency injunction first thing Monday. They can't touch it without a court order. Sunday afternoon. I decided to document the construction myself, needing to do something productive with my rage. Walking through what was once my wildflower meadow. I noticed the houses weren't randomly placed. Each one strategically blocked my mountain views, positioned to surround my Victorian home like a suburban siege. The message was clear, even if I kept my land. They'd make it worthless. Carlos Vega, one of the construction workers, approached me near the back fence while his colleagues took their lunch break. I'm sorry about this, he said quietly, glancing around nervously. My boss said you sold the land, but something felt wrong from day one. The way Mr. Fitzgerald kept checking over his shoulder during the groundbreaking. The way he insisted we start while you were out of town. He pulled out a worn phone, scrolling through images. I document all my work sites for my portfolio. Maybe some of these background details might interest you. The photos showed typical construction scenes, but Carlos had unknowingly captured gold in the backgrounds. In one, Fitzgerald stood with 2 men in suits, multiple documents spread on his car hood. Another showed him near the site trailer with what appeared to be different versions of the same paperwork. A third caught him in animated discussion with someone who looked like a city official, not smoking guns exactly, but pieces of a larger puzzle. Would you testify about what you saw? I asked hopefully. Carlos shook his head. I've got 3 kids to feed, but these photos, they're just my portfolio. Can't help what's in the background. He airdropped the files before walking away. That night, I sat in my grandfather's study, surrounded by photo albums and original property deeds dating back 8 decades. The house felt different now, watchful, like it was holding its breath for the battle ahead. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop now or lose everything. This is your final warning." I screenshot it immediately, adding it to our growing evidence file. The threat was almost reassuring in its desperation. Fitzgerald was getting nervous. Tomorrow, Michael would file our injunction and begin deposing witnesses. Tomorrow, we'd start unraveling the web of fraud that had trapped who knows how many families before me. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of defending not just property, but 3 generations of memories. Daniel Fitzgerald thought intimidation would work on a retired schoolteacher living alone. He'd calculated that I'd fold rather than fight, just like the Harrisons and Colemans before me. He'd calculated wrong. 3 generations of Reynolds women had defended this land through the Great Depression, 2 wars, and countless challenges. Each had faced their trials with quiet strength and fierce determination. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing down every name Carlos's photos had revealed, every connection Michael had uncovered, every thread in Fitzgerald's web of corruption. By morning, we'd have a battle plan. The HOA president wanted a war. He was about to learn that teachers knew how to do their homework, and this assignment was far from over. Monday morning arrived with the sound of chainsaws revving outside my bedroom window. I bolted upright, still in my nightgown, racing to the front porch to find a crew positioning themselves around my oak tree. "Stop!" I screamed, running barefoot across the dewy grass. "There's an injunction filed. You can't touch that tree," the crew leader, a weathered man with kind eyes, held up his hand to halt his team. "Ma'am, we've got a work order signed by the HOA board. Says this is an emergency removal." "Check with the courthouse," I insisted, my voice shaking with rage and fear. "My lawyer filed an emergency injunction first thing this morning." The man pulled out his phone, made a call, and after several tense minutes, his expression softened. "Stand down, boys," he called out. "There's indeed an injunction. We can't proceed." As the crew packed up their equipment, he approached me quietly. "Between you and me, that tree's as healthy as they come. In 30 years, I've never seen a sound oak labeled dangerous. You might want to get an independent arborist's report. Tree like that, it's worth fighting for." Michael arrived an hour later with mixed news, his young face showing the strain of our accelerating case. "The injunction will hold for now," he said, setting up his laptop on my kitchen table. "But Fitzgerald's lawyer is pushing for an expedited hearing. They're claiming the tree poses an immediate threat to the new construction." He paused, studying my face with concern. "Here's the interesting part. The lawyer representing the HOA, he's also corporate counsel for Apex Corporation, same firm representing both entities in what should be separate matters. It suggests coordination that goes beyond normal business relationships." By noon, we had our first major breakthrough. Kayla Edwards, the county records clerk who'd contacted me through Michael's paralegal, agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. She looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder as she slid a manila envelope across the table. "I make copies of everything before documents get modified," she explained quietly, her fingers trembling slightly. "Started doing it 3 years ago when I noticed discrepancies. Call it insurance, or maybe just paranoia. But I scan originals before they go into the system for updates." Tertius. Inside were photocopies showing differences between original filings and what currently existed in the county system. Property surveys with boundary lines that shifted over time. Transfer papers with suspicious timing patterns. And internal memos discussing development opportunities with certain properties highlighted in yellow. Nothing explicitly criminal, but the patterns were unmistakable. "The highlighted properties," she whispered. "They all ended up being sold under duress within 6 months. Every single one." "How many families?" I asked, studying the papers with growing horror. "At least 20 that I can document," she replied, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop noise. "The pattern's always similar. Violations suddenly escalate. Fines mount up beyond reason. Families sell under pressure. Then 6 months later, new construction worth triple the purchase price appears." She pulled out a handwritten list, names in careful script. The Wongs, the Garcias, the O'Briens, the Washingtons. Some elderly couples who passed away shortly after selling. Their families never knew what really happened. That afternoon, Michael and I visited families who'd been forced to sell. The Thompsons lived in a cramped apartment complex on the outskirts of town, a far cry from their former 4-bedroom home. "They fined us $500 a day for grass height violations," Mrs. Thompson said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she served us tea in mismatched cups. "We measured it ourselves every week, always within regulations, but their inspector had different measurements each time. We fought for 6 months, spent our entire retirement savings on lawyers who seemed to get nowhere." Mr. Thompson pulled out a battered folder stuffed with receipts and notices. "When the fines hit $30,000, they threatened foreclosure. We had 48 hours to decide sell to Fitzgerald's company or lose everything in court. Our granddaughter had to drop out of college because we couldn't help anymore. 6 months later, that same house sold for $800,000. They didn't even renovate it much, just painted and landscaped." The documentation showed a clear timeline. Violations started 2 weeks after they'd declined an unsolicited purchase offer, escalating monthly until the financial pressure became unbearable. The elderly Mr. Patterson, our second visit, lived with his daughter now but had transformed her spare room into a filing system. "As a retired attorney, I knew to document everything," he said, spreading papers across the coffee table with practiced precision. "Look at the inspection signatures. Same inspector cited 5 different properties on the same day, all homes that later sold under duress. The timing is statistically impossible for legitimate inspections. But individually, nothing that screams fraud. Together, it's a clear pattern of targeting." His evidence showed systematic harassment rather than smoking guns. Grass measurements that varied by inches between visits. Paint color violations for houses unchanged in decades. Mailbox heights suddenly non-compliant after 40 years. "They're smart," he admitted grudgingly. "Never anything overtly criminal in isolation. But the pattern 20 families forced out using identical tactics. That's not coincidence. That's conspiracy." By evening, we'd compiled enough pattern evidence to interest federal law enforcement. "The FBI's white-collar crime division will meet with us tomorrow," Michael explained as we organized documents in my dining room. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers marking our long day. When property fraud exceeds $5 million and involves multiple victims across several years, it becomes their jurisdiction. Agent Morrison specifically mentioned that organized HOA fraud is an emerging priority area. Too many communities nationwide reporting similar schemes. The scope was staggering. 20 families at an average loss of $200,000 each meant over $4 million in direct theft, not counting the profits from flipping the properties. "This isn't just fraud," Michael said quietly. "It's organized crime wearing the mask of community governance. The FBI takes that very seriously, especially when it targets elderly homeowners," as if sensing the walls closing in. Fitzgerald escalated again. I returned home to find a bright red notice plastered on my door. "Emergency HOA meeting. Vote to revoke property rights for community safety." The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday night, giving homeowners less than 48 hours notice. The agenda included a vote to grant the HOA emergency powers to seize property deemed detrimental to community welfare. The language was deliberately vague and threatening. "They can't legally do that," Michael said when I called him, his voice tight with anger. "HOAs don't have eminent domain powers. This vote would be legally meaningless in court, but they're counting on homeowners not knowing that. If they get a majority to vote yes, they'll use it as psychological pressure, claiming community support for their actions. Homeowners might believe it's binding and give up without fighting. It's intimidation dressed up as democracy." That night proved sleepless, despite my exhaustion. Outside my window, construction lights blazed through the darkness, turning my childhood meadow into an alien landscape. But now I understood the scope of what we faced. 20 families systematically robbed of their homes through bureaucratic terrorism. Retirees forced to start over. Grandchildren's educations sacrificed. Generational wealth stolen through forged documents and fabricated violations. I stood at my window, watching my oak tree sway in the night breeze, its ancient branches defiant against the harsh construction lights. Tomorrow, Kayla would share her carefully preserved documents with federal investigators. Wednesday, we'd pack that HOA meeting with informed homeowners ready to stand up to corruption. The war Fitzgerald had started was about to become a battle he couldn't win through intimidation alone. Wednesday's meeting would indeed be a turning point, just not the one he expected. Tuesday morning began with Michael calling before sunrise, his voice electric with urgency. "Margaret, the FBI wants to see us at 9 sharp. Agent Morrison says to bring everything, and I mean everything. They've been investigating similar schemes in 3 other states and think your evidence fills critical gaps in their case." I dressed carefully, choosing my most professional outfit, the one I'd worn for parent-teacher conferences when I needed to project authority. My hands trembled slightly as I packed boxes of evidence into my car, each document representing a family's stolen future. The weight of those boxes felt heavier, knowing they contained not just my fight, but the hopes of dozens of families. The FBI field office in downtown Denver felt like entering another world. Agent James Morrison looked younger than I'd expected, but his eyes held the sharpness of someone who'd seen too much corruption. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "We've been tracking HOA fraud schemes for 18 months across multiple states. Your documentation connects dots we've been trying to link. You've given us the patterns we needed." He led us through security checkpoints into a sterile conference room where 2 other agents waited, their faces professionally neutral, but alert. We spent 4 hours laying out documents while Morrison's team cross-referenced with their existing files. The process was methodical, each piece of evidence cataloged and connected to their broader investigation. This escalating fine pattern matches what we've seen in Arizona and Nevada, Morrison observed, studying the Thompson family's documentation. "But your evidence shows the direct connections between the HOA leadership and the development companies. That's what we've been missing. The paper trail linking the harassment to the property acquisitions. We had suspicions but no concrete proof until now." The agent pulled up a map on his laptop showing red pins across 3 states. Each pin represents a family forced from their home through HOA harassment. Over $50 million in property changed hands through these schemes. But prosecutors wouldn't move without clear evidence of coordination. Your documents show that coordination, the same players using the same methods across multiple properties. By noon, Kayla Edwards had arrived, visibly nervous but determined. She'd brought 3 banker's boxes of documents spanning 5 years. "I scan everything that comes through for processing before it enters the system," she explained to the agents, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Started doing it after a computer crash lost 3 months of records back in 2019. My personal backup saved the department then, so nobody questioned why I kept doing it. It became routine, just part of my workflow. When documents came back for corrections, I'd compare them to my scans. The changes were subtle but consistent. Property boundaries shifting by feet, signatures looking different, dates altered by just enough to change legal standings. She pulled out a flash drive from her purse. I kept digital copies of everything on encrypted drives, rotating them monthly and storing them at my sister's house. Maybe I was paranoid, but something felt wrong about all these last-minute changes to property documents. When I saw Mrs. Reynolds's name on the latest batch of alterations, and remembered she was that nice teacher who'd helped my daughter years ago, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Agent Morrison's team began cataloging her evidence with efficient precision. Within 2 hours, they'd identified clear patterns of document tampering across 17 properties. "This shows systematic fraud," Morrison noted, "but we need testimony from inside Fitzgerald's operation to connect these altered documents to specific intent. Paper trails are powerful, but human testimony makes them come alive for juries." He looked at me thoughtfully. "That construction worker who gave you photos, Carlos Vega, might he cooperate with immunity?" I thought about Carlos, his nervousness when he'd shared those photos, his fear for his family's security. "He might, if you can guarantee his safety and continued employment." I called Carlos from a bureau phone, my heart pounding as it rang. When he answered, construction noise filled the background, the sound of hammers and diesel engines. After explaining the situation and the immunity offer, silence stretched between us. I could almost hear him weighing his options, his family's needs against his conscience. Finally, "My family needs protection too. Can they guarantee that—" Morrison nodded when I relayed the question. "Full witness protection for his employment. He won't suffer for telling the truth." 2 hours later, Carlos sat across from us, his calloused hands wrapped around coffee, still dusty from the job site. "I've built on 7 properties after families were forced to sell." He began carefully, choosing each word. "Mr. Fitzgerald supervised those jobs personally, which was unusual. He's the money man, doesn't usually get his hands dirty with actual construction. He'd bring multiple sets of paperwork, different versions. I saw him meeting with various officials on job sites. There's a judge, Patricia Hawkins, who visited 3 properties we were developing. They'd talk privately in his trailer, sometimes for an hour or more. I don't know what was said, but the timing was always within weeks after a family had lost their home in her court." His testimony was circumstantial but compelling when combined with court records. Morrison's team found Judge Hawkins had presided over HOA lien cases with unusual frequency, somehow always being assigned these particular disputes. Her ruling pattern was stark 97% in favor of HOAs, compared to a state average of 60%. "That's statistically significant deviation," Morrison stated simply, "worth investigating her financial records for any connections to Fitzgerald's companies." By 4 o'clock, we'd returned to my house to gather additional evidence Michael had identified that morning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my driveway, but something felt wrong the moment we arrived. I noticed immediately that my front door was slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered checking it twice before leaving. The wood frame showed subtle marks where the lock had been professionally manipulated. Morrison drew his weapon, motioning us back to the cars while he and another agent cleared the house. Those 10 minutes felt like hours, standing in my own driveway like a stranger while federal agents searched my childhood home for threats. They emerged with grim expressions. "Someone's been through your files. Nothing destroyed, but clearly photographed. Every document touched, every drawer opened. This is professional intimidation, meant to show they can reach you anywhere." My study showed subtle but thorough disturbance. Papers had been removed, photographed, and carefully replaced, but not quite in their original positions. My computer had been accessed despite password protection, though they had been careful not to damage anything. Even family photo albums had been moved, a particularly cruel touch that made my skin crawl. The message was crystal clear. We know everything about you. We've been in your most private spaces, and we can come back any time. This is actually good for our case, Morrison said, though his reassurance felt hollow as I surveyed my violated sanctuary. It shows consciousness of guilt and attempt to intimidate a federal witness. I'm putting surveillance on your house immediately. They've just added witness tampering to their list of charges. That evening, as FBI technicians installed cameras and checked my phone lines, Fitzgerald made his critical error. My phone rang at exactly 7 o'clock. His name bold on the caller ID. Morrison's team was ready, recording equipment active and agents listening on parallel lines. I took a deep breath and answered. Margaret. His voice was controlled, but with an undercurrent of strain, like a wire pulled too tight. I heard you visited downtown today. Federal involvement seems excessive for a simple property dispute. Don't you think? Surely we can resolve this between neighbors. If you have something to say. Daniel, say it. I replied steadily, using his first name deliberately to show I wasn't intimidated. I'm offering a solution, a graceful exit for everyone. Withdraw your complaints, drop the lawsuit, and your property remains completely untouched. The construction can be relocated to the eastern parcels. Your tree stays. You live peacefully for your remaining years. This very generous offer expires at tomorrow night's meeting. My remaining years, I repeated slowly, ensuring the threat was captured clearly on the recording. Your retirement years, of course, he said with a chuckle that held no warmth. Poor choice of words, but think carefully. Margaret, by tomorrow night, decide whether you want to be a hero or a homeowner. History shows you can't be both. Ask the families who came before you. The line went dead. Morrison looked satisfied, almost pleased. Attempted bribery, witness intimidation, and implied threat. He's panicking, making mistakes. Desperate people always do. That night, despite the FBI surveillance car parked across from my house and new security cameras watching every angle, sleep eluded me completely. Tomorrow's HOA meeting would be crucial, a battlefield where paperwork and testimony would clash with power and corruption. We had federal agents ready to attend, boxes of documented evidence, and a growing coalition of victims ready to speak their truth. But Fitzgerald had power, deep connections, and the desperation of a cornered animal. I sat in my grandfather's study until dawn, surrounded by family photos spanning 5 generations on this land. Each face reminded me why this fight mattered beyond my own property rights. 20 families forced from their homes, retirees living in cramped apartments, grandchildren whose college funds had vanished into legal fees and forced sales. Tomorrow, their silenced voices would finally be heard in a forum Fitzgerald couldn't control. Wednesday arrived with an unseasonable chill, as if nature itself sensed the storm about to break over Willowbrook Estates. I spent the morning with Michael and the FBI team, rehearsing our presentation for the evening meeting. Remember, Agent Morrison coached, we're there to observe and document. We only intervene if there's an immediate threat or if someone tries to flee. Let the community process play out naturally. By noon, something unexpected happened. My doorbell rang, and through the peephole I saw Arthur Hernandez, CEO of Apex Corporation, standing on my porch. The FBI agents monitoring my house tensed, but I recognized opportunity. Let him in, I told Morrison, but stay close. Hernandez looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled. Mrs. Reynolds, he began, clutching a briefcase like a life preserver. I need to talk. About Fitzgerald. About everything. He called me last night. Said the FBI was building a case. Then he threatened my family if I cooperated. That's when I knew I had to come forward. We sat in my living room, FBI agents within earshot, but out of sight. Hernandez's hands shook as he opened his briefcase. I don't have everything. Shredded most of it months ago when things got complicated. But I kept some insurance. He pulled out a handful of documents. Emails about targeting specific properties, a few bank transfers that show the money flow, some notes from meetings with Danny. It's not a smoking gun, but it shows the pattern. He spread the papers across my coffee table with trembling fingers. When Danny first approached me 5 years ago, it seemed legitimate. Properties acquired, developed, sold. But then the acquisition methods got questionable. I should have walked away. But the profits? He trailed off, then found his resolve. Judge Hawkins received consulting fees. I don't have all the records, but these 2 payments correspond to big cases she ruled on. Draw your own conclusions. The FBI agents recorded everything while Hernandez talked for an hour. He didn't have perfect documentation, but what he provided filled gaps in the pattern. Morrison finally showed his badge. Mr. Hernandez, we'll need you to make a formal statement. Your cooperation will be noted. The developer nodded miserably. I'm 73 years old. I just want this over. By 4 o'clock, word had spread that tonight's meeting would be significant. Michael fielded calls from homeowners who'd never attended before. The community center's too small, he said. The high school's letting us use their auditorium. And at 6:30, I arrived to find the auditorium already half full. Families I'd never seen at HOA meetings filled the seats. The Thompsons were there, no longer hiding their pain. Mr. Patterson sat front row with his legal pad. The room buzzed with nervous energy and barely contained anger. Fitzgerald arrived at 6:50 with the HOA board and his lawyer. He projected confidence, but I caught the tightness around his eyes when he saw the crowd size. He'd expected 50 compliant homeowners. Instead, 300 citizens faced him. This is highly irregular, he announced, taking the podium. HOA meetings follow specific protocols. This venue change wasn't properly noticed. Someone shouted, "Neither was stealing our homes." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Fitzgerald pressed on, jaw clenched. Tonight's agenda includes a vote on emergency powers to maintain property values and community standards, he began, still trying to control the narrative. Certain elements have resisted reasonable oversight, forcing us to consider stronger measures. Michael stood up. Point of order. Before any vote, homeowners have the right to present relevant information. He held up a folder. We have evidence of systematic fraud affecting dozens of families. The room stirred as family after family stood to speak. Mrs. Thompson described losing their home to escalating fines. 2 other families briefly confirmed similar experiences. The pattern was clear without belaboring each story. When my turn came, I walked to the microphone with my evidence folder. These documents show forged signatures, altered property lines, and financial irregularities, I said. Projecting slides onto the screen, 27 properties were acquired through questionable means, then flipped for massive profits. The evidence suggests coordinated action between the HOA leadership and certain development interests. Fitzgerald stood abruptly. These allegations are baseless. This meeting is adjourned. As he moved toward the exit, Agent Morrison and 2 other agents quietly positioned themselves by the doors. They didn't advance or make a scene, just stood as silent reminders that leaving wasn't advisable. You can't adjourn unilaterally, Board Member Barbara Thompson said unexpectedly. We need a board vote. Other board members nodded, suddenly finding courage in numbers. Fitzgerald returned to the podium, his composure cracking. That's when Arthur Hernandez entered from the back. Fitzgerald's face drained of color. Danny, I've told them what I know. It's over. Hernandez walked steadily forward, avoiding Fitzgerald's stare. I've provided documents to the FBI about the kickbacks, the judge, the targeting of families. I'm cooperating fully. The silence was deafening. Then Judge Teresa Brooks stood in the audience. As a member of this community and the judiciary, I'm appalled. I'll be reporting this to the State Judicial Review Board immediately. Fitzgerald's control finally shattered. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I transformed this community. These properties were stagnating, and I created value. I deserve compensation for my vision. These people—" He gestured wildly at the crowd. They were holding everyone back. Morrison stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Fitzgerald, you're under arrest for federal racketeering charges. Please come with us." As they cuffed him, Fitzgerald locked eyes with me. "You destroyed everything. Your stubborn principles destroyed progress." "No, Daniel," I replied steadily. "Your greed destroyed lives. We're just cleaning up the mess." After they led him out, the remaining board members huddled briefly. Barbara Thompson took the microphone. "Given tonight's revelations, the board moves to establish an interim committee to review all HOA operations while we schedule proper elections. All enforcement actions are suspended pending review." The motion passed unanimously among the shell-shocked board. By 10 o'clock, Willowbrook Estates had taken its first steps toward recovery. The work ahead would be massive, reviewing every suspicious transaction, helping displaced families, rebuilding trust. But tonight, for the first time in years, the community had reclaimed its voice. As people filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or share their own stories. The Garcias told me about their mother dying just weeks after they were forced to sell. The Washingtons described the depression that followed losing their home of 30 years. Each story strengthened my resolve to see this through to the end. Michael found me as the auditorium emptied. "You did it," he said simply. "This is just the beginning," I replied, looking at the stage where Fitzgerald had made his last stand. "Now comes the hard part, making sure justice actually gets served and helping our community heal." And outside, the construction equipment on my property sat silent in the darkness. Tomorrow, it would be removed. The illegal houses would be demolished. My oak tree would continue to stand. But the real victory wasn't about property lines or construction permits. It was about a community finding the courage to say no to corruption, even when that corruption wore the mask of progress. The fight wasn't over. Court battles loomed, depositions awaited. Some families would never recover what they'd lost. But tonight, Willowbrook Estates had proved that, when neighbors stand together, even the most entrenched corruption can be exposed and defeated. And sometimes, that's enough to begin healing. Thursday morning dawned with Willowbrook Estates in chaos. News vans lined our usually quiet streets, reporters knocking on doors, seeking reactions to what they were calling the largest HOA fraud scheme in Colorado history. I kept my curtains drawn and phone unplugged, focusing instead on the mountain of work ahead. Michael arrived at 8 with boxes of additional evidence and a grim expression. "Fitzgerald posted bail," he said without preamble. $2 million. His lawyers already filing motions to suppress evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure. "Let him file," I replied, pouring coffee with steady hands. "Everything we have was obtained legally. Kayla's documents were her personal copies. Hernandez came forward voluntarily. The FBI followed every procedure." Michael nodded, but looked troubled. "He's also suing you personally for defamation, claiming you orchestrated a witch hunt that destroyed his reputation and business interests. He's seeking $5 million in damages." I almost laughed at the audacity. His reputation. What about the 27 families whose lives he destroyed? But I understood the strategy. Fitzgerald was trying to intimidate me into silence, to make the cost of fighting too high to bear. He'd miscalculated again, after what I'd seen, what I'd learned about the systematic destruction of my neighbors' lives. Backing down wasn't an option. By noon, the interim HOA committee had called another emergency meeting. This time, it was held in the community center, a return to normalcy after last night's drama. Barbara Thompson, serving as interim chair, had worked through the night reviewing HOA finances with a forensic accountant. What they'd found was staggering in its scope and audacity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Barbara announced to the packed room, "our initial review shows approximately $800,000 in HOA funds were diverted over the past 5 years. Payments to non-existent vendors, inflated maintenance contracts, legal fees for pursuing frivolous violations against homeowners who were later forced to sell. Every homeowner here has been robbed twice, through forced assessments and misappropriated funds." The crowd's anger was palpable, but controlled. These weren't mob members seeking vengeance. They were neighbors seeking justice and restitution. Mr. Patterson raised his hand. "What about the families who lost their homes? Can we help them recover damages?" Barbara nodded. "We're establishing a legal fund. Any homeowner who was forced to sell under duress will have access to pro bono legal representation for civil suits. 3 law firms have already volunteered their services." As the meeting progressed, more victims came forward. The elderly Mrs. Yamamoto's daughter spoke through tears about her mother dying in a nursing home after losing the house she'd lived in for 50 years. "She kept asking when she could go home," the daughter said, voice breaking. "I couldn't tell her it was gone. Sold for pennies on the dollar to pay fraudulent fines." The Johnsons revealed they'd been living in their car for 3 months after the forced sale, too proud to ask for help until their grandchildren started missing school. Then something unexpected happened. 3 current homeowners stood up, people who'd benefited unknowingly from the scheme. "We bought our homes through Fitzgerald's company," one admitted, voice shaking. "We were told the previous owners wanted quick sales for health reasons. We had no idea they were forced out. What do we do now?" The room fell silent, grappling with this new complexity. These families were victims too, in a way, having unknowingly participated in the fraud. Barbara handled it with remarkable grace. "You bought in good faith. You're not at fault. But if you're willing, testifying about the sales process could help the FBI's case." All 3 agreed immediately, relief visible on their faces. One added, "We'll also contribute to the legal fund. It's not right that we're living in homes taken from others through fraud." The community was choosing healing over division, unity over blame. By 2 o'clock, I was back home preparing for a national news interview. Fox had sent a crew from Denver, transforming my living room into a makeshift studio. As they adjusted lights and tested sound levels, I thought about the responsibility of speaking for so many victims. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was the voice of every family Fitzgerald had crushed under bureaucratic tyranny. The interview was live, adding pressure I hadn't anticipated. The anchor, Rebecca Chen, began gently. "Mrs. Reynolds, tell us how this started for you." I kept my answer focused. "I received a $100,000 fine for construction I knew nothing about. When I investigated, I found 9 houses being built on my property without my permission. My signature had been forged on permits. And this led to uncovering a massive fraud scheme," she pressed. "It led to discovering 27 families had been systematically targeted and forced from their homes." I corrected. "This isn't about me. It's about a community terrorized by someone who weaponized bureaucracy for profit. Elderly couples dying in nursing homes because they lost their family homes. Children dropping out of college because their grandparents' retirement funds went to fighting fraudulent fines." As we talked, B-roll footage played, showing the construction on my property, the confrontation at the meeting, Fitzgerald being led away in handcuffs. Then Rebecca asked the hard question. "Mr. Fitzgerald's attorney claims you're a disgruntled homeowner who conspired with others to frame an innocent man. How do you respond?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking of all the families watching. The evidence speaks for itself. Forged documents, altered property lines, financial records showing millions in suspicious transactions. The FBI doesn't arrest someone based on conspiracy theories. They arrest based on evidence of federal crimes. 27 families don't independently report identical patterns of harassment unless those patterns are real. After the interview, I found 57 messages on my phone. Homeowners from across the country sharing similar stories. Lawyers offering to help with civil suits. Even a Hollywood producer interested in the film rights. But buried among them was one that chilled me. You think you've won? This isn't over. Watch your back. DF. I immediately forwarded it to Agent Morrison, who called within minutes. We're taking this seriously. Fitzgerald's desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. We're increasing surveillance on your property. The threat felt different from his previous intimidation tactics. This was personal now. The rage of a man watching his empire crumble. That evening, the demolition began on my property. I stood at my window watching excavators tear down the illegal foundations. Each chunk of broken concrete representing a small victory. The machines worked with surprising delicacy around my grandmother's garden. The operators clearly instructed to minimize damage to the existing landscape. But the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge of what couldn't be undone. Families scattered, savings destroyed, trust shattered as darkness fell. Neighbors began gathering on my lawn, not planned, not organized, just a spontaneous show of solidarity. The Pattersons brought coffee. The new families who'd unknowingly bought stolen homes stood alongside original residents. Barbara Thompson left her mountain of paperwork to join us. Someone had brought camping chairs, and soon we had an impromptu vigil watching the demolition. 20 years ago, Mr. the Mister, Patterson said quietly. This was the kind of neighborhood where people looked out for each other, where kids played in every yard, and parents didn't worry. Fitzgerald made us afraid of each other instead, afraid to speak up, afraid to question authority. But look at us now. He was right. In trying to destroy our community for profit, Fitzgerald had inadvertently forged us into something stronger. By 10 o'clock, over 100 people stood watching the demolition. Someone started singing, "This land is your land," and others joined in. Voices uncertain but growing stronger. It wasn't a celebration exactly. It felt more like a healing ritual, a community exorcising its demons through shared witness. Children who'd never been allowed to play together before now roasted marshmallows over a small fire pit someone had brought. Michael found me in the crowd. The federal prosecutor called. With Hernandez's testimony and the new evidence from today's meeting, they're adding 37 more counts: mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. Fitzgerald's looking at 40 to 50 years if convicted on all charges. The numbers seemed abstract compared to the human cost surrounding me. But justice has to be measured somehow, as the crowd finally dispersed. I remained with a few others, watching the machines work under floodlights. My oak tree stood untouched, a witness to everything that had transpired. Tomorrow would bring more depositions, more revelations, more pain dredged up in service of justice. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't in weeks hope. The construction lights that had invaded my family's land now illuminated its liberation. By morning, the illegal structures would be gone. The land would begin to heal. And maybe, just maybe, so would we. As the last neighbors headed home, many stopped to thank me, but I knew the truth. This victory belonged to all of us, every family that refused to be silenced, every neighbor who chose courage over comfort. Fitzgerald had asked who I thought I was to challenge him. Tonight, surrounded by my community, the answer was clear. I was exactly who I needed to be, someone who said no. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver became a second home over the next 4 months. The case of United States versus Daniel Fitzgerald et al. Drew national attention, with cable news crews camping outside for each hearing. I attended every session, taking notes not just for myself but for the families who couldn't bear to relive their trauma in person. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Reeves, built their case methodically, each witness adding another layer to the evidence. Arthur Hernandez proved to be the prosecution's star witness. Under oath, he detailed the conspiracy with clarity born of guilt. Fitzgerald identified properties with elderly owners or financial vulnerabilities, he testified. He'd initiate code violations, escalate fines, then offer below-market purchases through my company. The jury took careful notes as he explained the financial structure. His cooperation agreement, the prosecutor explained to the jury, required complete truthfulness in exchange for consideration at sentencing, a standard practice in complex conspiracy cases. The defense tried to paint Hernandez as a bitter business partner, but the documentary evidence supported his testimony. Emails discussing motivated acquisitions, financial records showing unusual payment patterns, and meeting notes created a compelling narrative. When pressed, Hernandez admitted to destroying some documents, which actually strengthened his credibility. "I was scared," he said simply. "I kept just enough to protect myself." Week 3 brought testimony from victims, Mrs. Thompson spoke about choosing between heart medication and HOA fines, her voice steady despite trembling hands. The prosecutor summarized similar experiences from 17 other families to avoid repetition while maintaining impact. Each story transformed financial crimes into human suffering, making abstract fraud tangible for the jury. Judge Patricia Hawkins's testimony proved pivotal. Arrested separately, she'd negotiated a plea agreement typical for cooperating defendants in judicial corruption cases. "Fitzgerald paid me $10,000 per favorable ruling," she admitted, avoiding eye contact with the gallery. "Over 4 years, I ruled on 43 HOA cases." Her confession revealed 2 city councilmen and 3 code inspectors also receiving payments, expanding the conspiracy's scope beyond what we'd initially suspected. The defense's case struggled from the start. Their key witness, a property appraiser, contradicted himself when shown his own emails about property valuations. Fitzgerald chose not to testify, a right the judge carefully explained to the jury to avoid prejudice. His attorneys argued the government hadn't proven intent to defraud, that aggressive business practices weren't criminal, but multiple witnesses testifying to similar experiences created a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The prosecution's closing argument focused on abuse of power. "This wasn't sharp business practice," Reeves argued. "This was a systematic assault on homeowners using the very regulations meant to protect them." The defense countered that HOAs had legitimate authority to enforce standards, that homeowners had legal remedies they'd failed to pursue. It rang hollow after weeks of evidence showing those remedies had been corrupted. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in August. As the forewoman stood, the courtroom held its breath. "Guilty." The word rang out for the major counts: racketeering, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. Not guilty on some lesser charges, showing the jury's careful deliberation. Fitzgerald's face remained composed until the racketeering conviction, which carried the heaviest sentence. His shoulders sagged slightly, the only sign that reality had penetrated his armor. 2 weeks later, at sentencing, Judge William Morrison allowed limited victim impact statements. 5 families spoke, representing the broader group. I spoke briefly about community damage beyond individual losses. The judge, following federal sentencing guidelines with enhancements for breach of trust and targeting vulnerable victims, handed down his decision 37 years for Fitzgerald, within the range for his offense level. Hawkins received 12 years, reflecting her cooperation. Other defendants received sentences from probation to 8 years. Depending on their roles and cooperation. "The court must send a message," Judge Morrison stated, "that those who corrupt systems of community governance for personal gain will face serious consequences." As marshals led Fitzgerald away, he glanced once at the gallery. His expression held no remorse, just the cold calculation of a man already planning appeals. Outside the courthouse, families gathered quietly on the steps. Some wept with relief. Others simply stood in exhausted silence. The media sought reactions, but most victims declined comment, emotionally drained from the long process. This wasn't a movie ending with triumphant speeches. It was real people processing complex emotions after traumatic loss. That evening, Willowbrook Estates held a modest gathering at the community center. The interim HOA committee announced that recovered funds, limited by what could be seized from frozen assets, would be distributed proportionally to documented losses. It wouldn't make anyone whole, but it offered some relief. New HOA bylaws were presented: term limits, financial oversight, and conflict of interest rules. Nothing revolutionary, just common sense protections we'd lacked before. 3 months later, life in Willowbrook Estates had stabilized into a new normal. The illegal construction sites on my property were cleared, the land slowly recovering. Some families had returned, others had moved on, and new residents brought fresh energy. The Thompsons found a smaller house in the neighborhood, determined to stay despite everything. The Garcias remained in their apartment, but visited often, their grandchildren playing with others in the park. Not everything healed. Empty houses stood as reminders of families scattered by Fitzgerald's greed. Trust, once shattered, rebuilt slowly. HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, now drew careful scrutiny from homeowners who'd learned the cost of apathy. We'd survived, but we were changed, more vigilant, less naive about power unchecked. I still receive occasional letters from homeowners facing similar situations. Michael and I compiled our experience into a basic guide, hoping others might avoid our pain. The FBI used our case as one example in a broader investigation. Though systemic change came slowly, some communities learned from our experience, others repeated our mistakes. On the anniversary of that first confrontation, a few neighbors stopped by for coffee. No grand celebration, just quiet acknowledgement of survival. Children played in my yard, where construction equipment had once rumbled. The oak tree stood unchanged, a constant through chaos, as we talked. Someone mentioned that Fitzgerald's appeal had been denied. The news brought no joy, just a sense of finality. Looking back, I'm struck by how ordinary it all began. A refusal to open a gate, a simple assertion of property rights. Fitzgerald had counted on isolation and fear to enable his scheme. He hadn't anticipated that pushing too hard might unite the very people he'd worked to divide. In the end, we didn't defeat him through dramatic confrontation, but through patient documentation, careful testimony, and refusing to be silenced. Justice came neither swiftly nor completely. Lives disrupted weren't magically restored, but in a system where power often prevails over principle. We'd proven that sometimes, with persistence and evidence and collective courage. Regular people could hold the powerful accountable. That had to be enough, because it was all we had, and in the quiet survival of a wounded but healing community. Perhaps it was. 1 year later, I stood at my front window watching the mail carrier approach. My chest still tightened at certified letters, though these days they brought restitution checks rather than fraudulent fines. $32,000 had trickled in from asset forfeiture, enough to cover most legal expenses. Other families received proportional amounts. It wasn't full justice. But it was tangible acknowledgement of wrongs suffered. Michael called that afternoon with a legal update. Fitzgerald's second appeal was denied. He's running out of options. We'd stayed in touch professionally, bound by the case that had changed both our lives. He'd built a practice defending homeowners against HOA overreach, taking lessons from our fight to help others. The FBI recovered another 100,000 in hidden assets, but millions remain offshore. He was smart about hiding money, just not smart enough to hide his crimes. That evening's HOA meeting drew 23 homeowners, a sustainable number between crisis-packed rooms and former apathy. Barbara Thompson ran things efficiently. Every decision documented and voted on transparently. We'd learned that democracy required mundane participation, not just dramatic stands. The meeting covered routine business landscape contracts, maintenance schedules, budget reviews, normal HOA functions, but now with oversight that prevented abuse. After adjournment, I walked through the neighborhood with Mr. Patterson. "You know what I appreciate most," he said, pausing to rest. "The absence of fear. No more dreading the mail, checking for violations. Just ordinary life." He was right. The hypervigilance Fitzgerald had cultivated was fading, replaced by regular community rhythms. Not perfect, but genuine. Patricia Chen had returned last month, buying a small condo with her restitution money. "I needed to come back," she'd explained at the coffee shop. "Not to recapture what was lost, but to reclaim belonging. This is still my community." Her words captured what many felt. Fitzgerald had tried to steal more than property. He'd attacked the very concept of home. Some families couldn't return, wounds too deep or opportunities elsewhere. But those who did brought determination to prevent history's repetition. The Thompsons had found a smaller house 3 streets over, their garden modest but thriving. "We're different now," Mrs. Thompson had told me last week. "Less trusting of authority, more engaged. Maybe that's not entirely bad." They attended every HOA meeting, reviewed every document, asked questions that once would have seemed rude. Trauma had made watchdogs of us all. Not everything had healed smoothly. Empty houses dotted the neighborhood where families hadn't returned. New residents brought fresh energy but lacked our hard-won caution. Some neighbors remained bitter, unable to move past anger at those who'd stayed silent during Fitzgerald's reign. Trust rebuilt slowly, fragmenting along lines of who'd fought, who'd collaborated, who'd simply survived. My property showed subtle scars where foundations had been torn out, shallow depressions that would take years to level naturally. But native grasses grew over them, and deer had returned to graze in the evenings. The land was healing on its own timeline, indifferent to human drama. Nature's persistence offered its own lesson in resilience. That night, I reviewed correspondence from homeowners nationwide facing similar battles. Our case had become a cautionary tale and tactical template. Some communities succeeded in exposing corruption. Others discovered the price of justice too steep to pay. Each letter reminded me that our victory, however partial, wasn't guaranteed or common. We'd been fortunate in our evidence, our allies, our timing, before bed. I stood in my grandfather's study, surrounded by 3 generations of family photos. This room had served as our war room, where strategy was planned and evidence organized. Now it held normal life again bills, correspondence, the mundane paperwork of existence. The transformation from battlefield to simple home office marked healing more clearly than any ceremony could. Outside, my oak tree stood unchanged by the season's drama, its branches reaching toward stars. That tree had witnessed my grandparents' struggles, my parents' lives, my childhood, and now this chapter of violation and recovery. Its continuity offered perspective. Human conflicts, however consuming, passed like seasons. What endured was simpler land, shelter, community bonds tested but not broken. I locked the door and checked it twice, a habit that would probably never fade completely. Some changes were permanent. We'd lost innocence about power and governance. We'd gained vigilance that sometimes bordered on paranoia. The price of liberty, as the saying went, was eternal watchfulness. We'd learned that price could be extracted in increments of fear, legal fees, and lives disrupted. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges without grand significance. Bills to pay, errands to run, the daily maintenance of life reclaimed. The dramatic phase had passed, leaving harder work of simply continuing. Some days, anger at what we'd lost flared hot. Other days, gratitude for what we'd preserved overshadowed grievance. Most days fell between. Neither tragic nor triumphant, just life moving forward. The doorbell rang, unusual for the late hour. Through the peephole, I saw a young couple, prospective buyers for the Henderson place. "We're sorry to bother you," the woman said, "but we heard you know the neighborhood's history. We want to understand what really happened here." I invited them in, brewed coffee, and told them the truth, not dramatically, not bitterly, just facts they deserved to know before committing to this community. They listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, thanked me for honesty. As they left, the husband turned back. "It sounds like you all went through hell, but you're still here. That says something good about this place." Perhaps it did. We'd faced systematic corruption and survived. We'd lost neighbors, money, and peace of mind, but retained our homes and discovered collective strength. Fitzgerald sat in federal prison while we sat in our kitchens, planning gardens and attending meetings, and slowly forgetting to flinch at official envelopes. If that wasn't complete victory, it was enough. My land remained mine. My rules remained respected. And in a small Colorado community. Neighbors had learned the cost of complacency and the value of vigilance. We'd never be the same, but we were still here. In the end, presence itself was a form of triumph.